Welcome to today's Situational Intelligence Briefing. We've got a critical explainer for you today on the deepening U.S.-Iran standoff, specifically looking at where things stand as of late April 2026. What started as a rapid series of kinetic engagements has, quite frankly, hardened into a protracted state of both geopolitical and economic attrition. We're going to break down exactly how this conflict is functioning mechanically and map out the severe ripple effects it's sending straight through the global economy. Here's our agenda for the briefing. We'll start with the physical realities of the dual blockade, then quantify the global economic fallout. From there, we'll look at the current diplomatic impasse, dissect the internal power struggles happening right now in Tehran, and wrap up with our strategic outlook. Okay, let's dive into this and get right to the bottom line up front. Section 1, the dual blockade. We're looking at maritime denial in the Strait of Hormuz. So following Iran's initial closure of the strait back on March 2nd, the United States initiated what we are defining here as a counter-blockade. Managed directly by U.S. CENTCOM since April 13th, this naval strategy is designed to intercept vessels and completely halt Iranian oil exports. The goal? Starve the regime of hard currency. And they're enforcing it aggressively. As of late April, CENTCOM has intercepted or diverted at least 38 vessels. The pressure is actually so immense that tracking data shows Iran has been forced to pull retired very large crude carriers like the Nasha out of mothballs just to use as floating storage, simply because their onshore tanks are overflowing. And the physical reality of this choke point out on the water, it is incredibly stark. Remember, during peacetime, a full 20% of all global petroleum and liquid natural gas transits right through here. To enforce their March 2nd closure, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps laid underwater mines and deployed severe interference with maritime automatic identification systems. The specter of a threat is so high right now that maritime insurers literally mandate that ship owners secure explicit Iranian authorization just to guarantee safe passage. Think about that. It essentially grants Tehran de facto sovereignty over international waters. And it's not an empty threat. On April 18th, the IRGC actually fired on 2 vessels just to enforce this reality after the U.S. refused to lift its port blockade. Moving to Section 2, global trade and economic fallout. Let's quantify the damage. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how instantly that physical blockade ripples outward into absolute market chaos. 10.1 million. That is the staggering number of barrels per day that global oil supply plummeted by in March alone, according to the International Energy Agency. Because OPEC Plus suddenly finds itself without any viable export routes, we are currently living through what the IEA characterizes as literally the largest single supply disruption in history. Let's walk through this hard data, because the disconnect between the physical market and the futures market right now is extreme. Just look at Brent crude spot prices. They are up 50% to $108 a barrel. Over in Asia, Singapore middle distillate has hit a record high of $290 a barrel. Crucially, Qatari LNG, which usually commands a 20% global share, has declared force majeure. That is a total halt on exports. And logistically, because major firms like Maersk have completely suspended Middle East transits, shipping companies are rerouting globally. Check out the Panama Canal auction fees. They have absolutely skyrocketed, with firms now paying up to $4 million just to secure a single last-minute transit slot. This is the literal definition of a shattered supply chain. And this cascading logistical failure brilliantly, or rather terrifyingly, illustrates the massive stagflation risk, particularly for energy-dependent European economies. When you take a 50% jump in Brent crude and combine it with a staggering 100% spike in the European gas benchmark, the Dutch TTF, following that halt of Qatari LNG, well, these economies are staring down the barrel of a devastating combination of stagnant growth and massive industrial inflation. But beyond the macroeconomic data, there is a very real, severe humanitarian toll here. The UN Development Program is warning that the scarcity of fertilizer and basic goods triggered by this blockade could push 32 million people worldwide into poverty. For policymakers, this goes way beyond just an economic issue. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres so starkly warned, this means empty fuel tanks, empty shelves, and empty plates, which historically is a recipe for global civil unrest. Section 3, the diplomatic impasse. We're looking at a phased peace proposal going head-to-head with maximum pressure. Over on the left side, we have the contours of an Iranian-phased proposal that leaked via Axios on April 27th. Basically, Tehran offered to end its closure of the strait and allow commercial traffic to resume, provided the U.S. lifted its naval blockade first. The catch?
Any discussions regarding Iran's nuclear program and its stockpile of highly enriched uranium would just be kicked down the road to a later date. Now compare that to the right side, the rigid U.S. maximum pressure goals. For Washington, absolute free navigation isn't a bargaining chip, it's the baseline. And the ultimate requirement is zero enrichment and no nuclear weapon capabilities. So you can see, Iran's proposal was clearly designed to relieve their economic pressure without actually yielding on those core U.S. nuclear demands. So the crucial point is really captured here in Secretary of State Marco Rubio's immediate rejection of that offer. He flatly stated the U.S. cannot normalize Iran having control of the Strait of Hormuz. The administration is drawing a hard line. They absolutely refuse to accept a system where Iran gets to dictate the tolls, the criteria, or the conditions for international shipping passage. And the timeline around this diplomacy was highly chaotic. On April 25th, President Trump abruptly canceled his top envoy's scheduled trip to Pakistan, citing wasted time and costs, basically telling the Iranians to come to the U.S. if they seriously wanted to talk. Just a bit later that same day, the president claimed on social media that Iran had sent a much better proposal within 10 minutes of that cancellation. Then 2 days later, the details of that initial rejected proposal leaked out via Axios. What this timeline really highlights is the administration's apparent belief that their counter-blockade is actually working. They believe this severe economic pain is the exact lever needed to force the regime into making genuine core concessions.
Section 4. Adversary Internal Dynamics. Let's dig into the regime schism.
Internally, the Iranian government is profoundly fragmented right now. On the left, you have the maximalist hardliners, led by IRGC Commander Brigadier General Ahmad Vahidi. They are prioritizing ideological survival and military dominance, and they're totally willing to risk conflict. But on the right, you have the pragmatists, led by President Masoud Pezeshkian and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. They are desperately trying to prioritize economic stability, warning that this current crisis simply cannot be survived.
And we know the U.S. counterblockade is actively fracturing that internal cohesion. Back in late April, a group of senior Iranian officials signed a secret letter sent directly to Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. Their warning was incredibly stark. They flat out stated the economic crisis caused by the blockade is unsustainable, and that negotiations over the nuclear program are, quote, unavoidable.
But despite that glaring warning, the hardliners have consolidated their power. General Vahidi has prevailed for now, choosing military hard power over rescuing their collapsing economy. The IRGC has even publicly criticized the civilian foreign minister, Araghchi. And, as we saw with those April 18th attacks in the Strait, they've unilaterally resumed kinetic engagements. So while the regime put on a highly choreographed display of unity on April 23rd, the reality on the ground is that the pragmatists have been entirely sidelined by the military apparatus, which is actively derailing any diplomatic progress. Which brings us to Section 5, Strategic Outlook, the persistence of the stalemate. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final forecast. Looking at the bifurcated reality of May 2026, we're facing a deeply entrenched stalemate. We've got a Middle East with zero maritime freedom. The U.S. is executing maximum pressure 2.0, banking heavily on the idea that this economic destruction will literally break the Iranian regime. Meanwhile, Tehran's hardliners have proven they're prepared to endure that extreme economic hardship just to maintain their leverage. And, of course, we have to acknowledge the volatile reality back home. The U.S. domestic landscape is becoming increasingly polarized, driven by anxieties over automated selective service registration, potential conscription, and the recent assassination attempt at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So, we leave you with this final critical question to consider. Can a supposed better proposal actually bridge this massive, foundational gap between rigid U.S. nuclear demands and Tehran's desperate need for economic survival? Because if neither side blinks soon, this acute geopolitical standoff is going to permanently reshape the global economic order. Thank you for joining this Intelligence Explainer. Keep your eyes on the data.